How's it going, everyone? So in today's video, I kind of want to continue that kind of focus on the modern 90s house kind of style that we touched on in a few tutorials previously. And I kind of want to touch on something quite specific in this tutorial, which I feel is kind of a big part of that kind of sound these days, which is sampling. So this tutorial is essentially going to take you through the entire sampling process specific to that 90s house style. So we're going to start with the digging process and basically where you might dig and what you might look for. And then we'll move on to how to kind of sample these tracks using like AI tools. And we'll then finish off with some kind of live examples of how you might integrate these samples into your projects. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. So in this first section, I kind of want to touch on basically the kind of digging process, and we'll kind of cover a few kind of aspects to that. And I think the best kind of thing to start with is basically like think about like why you might sample. I find there tends to be like two main reasons you might want to sample. The first being it's kind of like a great way to start carving out your own sound, which is like inspired by your own unique influences. The other kind of reason is it can kind of help you achieve a certain character to your sound. So instead of wasting loads of time kind of going down the route of processing a kick drum, for example, you can kind of take the shortcut of sampling your favorite producers' kick drums and incorporating that into your styles. So that's pretty much why you might do it. When it comes to actually looking for these tracks, you can obviously look for your record collection, but I find basically doing some digging online and looking through like different music sources, so like your Discogs, Beatport, SoundCloud, like you have loads of potential with them, but YouTube tends to be one I quite like. And basically going on a dig through playlists and then looking through the algorithm and just trying to find like different sources you might be able to sample. There's a track I came across recently, which was this one, which is a tune. So immediately I'm thinking like vocals, drums, possibly synths and bass, but I might not be able to get a clean kind of rip of that. So I'm just listening out for like elements I can potentially sample, like this.
I thought that you would have it all. Think you're so fine, baby. I just wanna take you home. Then you came up close and something seemed to change my mind. Got to thinking that you are not the perfect guy. That shirt you're wearing makes me think that you are going blind.
So that's just one example of a track. You can then basically start looking for the algorithm. So I don't know half these tracks, but you can just kind of tell like which ones you're looking for. So YouTube is just a great resource for like finding these tracks. I'll just do a few more examples. I can see that organ doing quite well, the kind of shakers. That piano bit. I'm hearing a lot of like these kind of pianos in these newer tracks. The bass, sick. That synth, beautiful. So that's that kind of track, and then the last one is this one. So you'll hear like all these kind of different elements that you could potentially use. Like vocals is kind of like the common one that you hear these days, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear like different kind of drum elements layered, or bass lines, albeit with different sounds and kind of using the same melodies, and then the kind of piano chord patterns as well that you hear so prominently. So that essentially concludes the kind of section on digging. So once you've kind of found these kind of tracks, the next step is essentially to purchase them and basically have the file ready to then go into the next step of the process. So I've talked about this tool before when it comes to like vocals, but you could actually take this further and split it up into like loads of different stems. So just to show an example, what I could do is I'll go to that Unity track, which I have already split, but just to kind of show you the process, this one. So basically find a bunch of those tracks and buy them and put them into a folder, and then go through this kind of process of splitting these tracks up into different stems, and then you can like export them. So once you've gone through the kind of process, you essentially get the kind of 4 channels split up. It also tells you the kind of key and BPM as well, which is quite useful. So I could just play it now, and I can just solo the different parts. You'll hear it's not perfect, but it's doable. Like you can get away with a certain quality, and when you go to like mix it, you can kind of get away with it. It can almost hide quality issues to an extent, so don't worry about that. That's quite cool. So it's picked up a few of the vocals. So it's kind of why working with really clean, high quality audio is best for this process. It's not a necessity, like I was saying. You can kind of clean it up and process it in a way that it kind of hides the artifacts. But ideally, you want to be working with the best quality audio and the kind of cleanest sections. So the music has potential. We could use the vocal. So I can definitely hear like these kind of vocals potentially used in some of these tracks. So the vocal's probably the one that most people would use this kind of thing for. Bass, if you wanted to like take inspiration from a pattern or a sound. I could see potential there. And then maybe drums, if you wanted to isolate a certain loop or sound. So the next step would be to then go into the save, and you can basically save each of the stems individually and basically then save them in a kind of accessible folder. And that's essentially how you can approach the kind of stem separation process. Up next, what we'll talk about is basically how to integrate these stems into your project and kind of make them a bit more your own. So I've obviously gone through that kind of stem separation process, and I've basically used it on a few different tracks. So I've basically got the stems for 2 of the tracks we previewed previously. So I've kind of got a bit of a mashup of examples. So I've kind of mashed the moving now vocals with the music from the Unity mix. I've pitched it up 3 because it was in D minor, so I pitched up 3 semitones to put it in tune. So that's one way you can kind of make it your own, is to kind of repitch it. You hear a lot of that noise as well, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just kind of adding texture, I guess, especially when it's blended with the other elements. The thing I liked about this melody was the actual sound. So I basically kind of like started manipulating it, and I would obviously take it further if I was gonna go on and finish this track, because when you're kind of sampling melodic parts, especially if it's like a long loop like that, it's kind of ripping off the original. Like the stuff you can get away with and ripping off a pretty long segment of audio from an original isn't really the right way to approach sampling. It's either use one shots or like properly manipulate it, cut it up, kind of similar to this, utilize the sound, that kind of thing. So I kind of did that, and then the kind of sound reminded me of, like, really unrelated, but the sound reminded me of a track called Vivid Dreams by like an artist called Kate Tronada. So I basically took kind of organ from that and this sound reminded me of the exact same sound from that. So what I've kind of done is I've sliced up the original loop, loaded a sequencer, and basically just had it record like different kind of notes. So I've obviously used a different example, just because that's the kind of what this track reminded me of. So I basically found that track, but you could in theory load kind of like one shot if it was a good enough quality and do something similar. Obviously I've kind of gone down the sampling route, but if you want access to high quality organ sounds, I'll point you in the direction of our House and Garage organ sample pack, which essentially comes with 175 different organ samples, which are kind of like perfect for this style. And then the kind of vocal is just really well suited for this style. So these kind of vocals just work really well for these tracks, and I feel like that kind of digging exercise can take you down a whole mental rabbit hole of finding crazy music that no one these days is familiar with. So kind of going down this kind of sample route can kind of really help you, like I was saying at the start, to kind of carve out your own kind of sound and let those influences that you have really shine through in your own music. So got that vocal, and then later on in the process we just have a completely mental switch up where I've kind of taken this kind of piano chord jam that you hear in a lot of these tracks, with a different vocal. I like the pattern of it, and obviously you get certain characteristics from sampling, but sometimes you might not want those characteristics. Sometimes you might just want to kind of reuse that kind of pattern in your own way with different sounds. So a trick you can use, which I've kind of started, is right clicking, going convert to new harmony, and it will attempt to analyze the kind of chords. It's not always perfect. It's kind of there or thereabouts, and you kind of have to go in and tweak, shorten notes so it's more basically similar to that pattern, but it's kind of the approach I would go for. I'd basically take inspiration from that kind of pattern and try and do it with a different sound. The final kind of thing is these kind of like synths. So these work really well. I've kind of like chopped them up, and you'd be able to get away with this just because the kind of section's so short. And then the final kind of element, which was in the original, but I basically took the kind of pattern from and just used a different sound, was the kind of string. So yeah, that's pretty much can conclude this one. I hope you kind of found it useful in kind of learning more about the kind of process that 90s house producers might go down when it comes to like sampling. As always, I'll leave a bunch of resources, including the kind of organ sample pack and the project as well, in the description if you want that and all the sounds. If you can do us a massive favor and like the video, subscribe and comment if there's anything you want to see, and I'll see you next time.